Question number 2, Andrew Little.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does he stand by his statement that, quotes, locally based providers can be closer and more responsive to their community, end quotes, in relation to the government's policy to sell state houses to private providers?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, yes, and registered community housing providers will need to have a local presence and a strong capacity to meet the needs of their tenants.
Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
How would a company based in Brisbane be, quotes, closer and more responsive, end quotes, to the needs of Kiwi families in social housing?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, because they will have to be not only registered in New Zealand, have a presence in New Zealand, be subject to the Community Housing Provider Regulatory Authority. Mr Speaker, if the head office of a company or organisation rules somebody out from doing anything, then I suggest the member never go and have another Big Mac, because this will come as breaking news, but head offices in America.
Supplementary.
Order. Order. I'm wanting to call the Leader of the Opposition. Andrew Little. Order.
Mr.
Supplementary
Speaker,
question.
what lessons can a company that provides housing on the Gold Coast teach New Zealand about running social housing in Invercargill?
Well, the Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Firstly, this organisation would have to be, if it bought those properties, be registered in New Zealand, subject to the Community Housing Regulatory Authority, be subject to regular engagement with its tenants, be a responsible tenancy manager, have routine inspections and be responsive when it comes to repairs and maintenance. So they have to run a New Zealand operation. Mr Speaker, I'm a little surprised that the New Zealand Labor Party hate Horizons, because here's a press release from the Deputy Prime Minister of Australia when the Labor government was in office, saying what an amazing organisation they are and how good they are and what a great job they've done. Mr Speaker, I know something Australian's very scary to the Labor Party, but over here we just want someone who can provide a good service.
Order.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
What precise, measurable, provable benefits would be realised by selling these houses to an Australian company that cannot be realised by housing in New Zealand?
The Right Honourable Prime
Mr
Minister.
Speaker, the member's asking a wider question about what are the benefits of social housing, Mr Speaker, because if Horizons were to buy these properties, they would have to provide the same role as any other community housing provider. Mr Speaker, so what I can say in regard to that is that there is widespread support for community housing providers from all parts of this Parliament, Mr Speaker. In fact, one member of Parliament has gone to say, with relation to this area, there is, quote, no controversy. I see huge benefits in this vision of a bigger, more diverse social housing sector. That, of course, comes from Mr P. Twyford of the Labor Party.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Order. Order. This is a point of order. I wish to hear it.
Mr Speaker, my question was very straight and it was pretty precise.
Order. On this occasion, I agree with the Leader of the Opposition. I'm going to ask him to ask that question again.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. What precise, measurable, provable benefits would be realised by selling these houses to an Australian company that cannot be realised by housing in New Zealand?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Same as New Zealand ones.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Tim McIndoe.
We don't need help from you guys.
Thank you, sir.
Order. Tim McIndoe.
Thank you, sir. What support has the Prime Minister seen for the government's policy of transferring ownership of houses to grow the community housing sector?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
I've seen lots of support, including a good summary of the government's social housing reform legislation, which passed last year, and it says as follows: what does this bill do? It shifts housing stock out of the hands of Housing New Zealand into community housing sector. This is something that Labor is perfectly comfortable with, and goes on to say The bill is extending the...
Order. I apologise to the Right Honourable Prime Minister. Point of order.
Mr Speaker, last week you made it very clear, and you have repeatedly over the last few weeks, that the government shouldn't use government supplementary questions to attack the opposition, which is exactly what the Prime Minister was doing.
No, Order, I don't need assistance. That's a judgment that I make, but when I look at the question, what support has the Prime Minister seen for this change of ownership the government's proposing? That is a legitimate question in my mind. The Prime Minister...
Point of order.
Point of order, the Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, I would just urge you, I mean, your ruling is absolutely correct, but I would just urge you to go away and consider what Mr Hipkins just raised, because what he's essentially saying is it's impossible within a debate for the government to point out in question time, within a wider debate about social housing, to point out what has been said on all parts of this debate. That would be...
Order, and I appreciate the point, and that's exactly the point that I'm trying to make in responding to Chris Hipkins. There will be questions that I think are put down which is no more than a cheap opportunity by a government to attack another political party, and they're the ones I will not accept. In this case, I think it's quite a legitimate question to ask about what support's out there in the community, and if that happens to be levelled onto another political party in this parliament, I can't help. The Prime Minister can complete his answer if it's required. Further supplementary? Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
In relation to the government's announced proposal to sell state houses to an Australian owner, and given that the Salvation Army in New Zealand has backed out of the proposal to them to purchase state houses, and also that iwi in New Zealand only want the houses for free, and so that he now resorts to Aussie buyers, will his government press ahead with selling state houses even if no New Zealand providers can afford to buy them and there are no tangible benefits to the families living in them?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Member's question is incorrect.
Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
Isn't the truth of it that this policy was always about the ideology of selling off state houses, whatever the cost, not about improving the lives of the families in those houses at all, and like all his policies, it's now falling apart?
Right, order. Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, what is falling apart were Housing New Zealand houses we inherited after 9 years of a Labor government because they failed to maintain them. What everybody knows actually is there is more demand and has been under numerous governments than there is supply. And Mr Speaker, in Australia and actually in many countries we see the equivalent of social housing providers or community housing providers adding to the overall stock. And that's why in a place like Australia, the Labor Deputy Prime Minister actually gets up and celebrates this. And Mr Speaker, this is the reality. The Labor Party in New Zealand is scared of an Australian charity coming to New Zealand. They must be incredibly scary because their foundation shareholders...
Order. The answer's gone on for long enough.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Tim McIndoe.
Thank you, sir. What other support has the Prime Minister seen for the government's social housing reforms?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I've seen a series of statements supporting the government's approach, including, for example, the Minister's vision is that Housing New Zealand should become just another tenancy provider competing in a contestable market with the community housing sector for both tenants and subsidies. We want to see a larger, more capable, empowered community housing sector. It's certainly a view that Labor shares. That again was Phil Twyford.
Supplementary.
Order. Order. All right. Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
Given that the mass sell-off of state houses was meant to be his defining policy for the year, as outlined in January, what is left after 6 months of fiasco, and why doesn't he just give up on this failed experiment?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, on the latter, because I actually care about New Zealanders who deserve some accommodation, and I'm not going to be driven by a bit of mumbo-jumbo into not providing more social houses to New Zealanders. And secondly, Mr Speaker, that was an important policy announcement at the start of the year, but also I've made a great many other policy announcements this year, and so far we're waiting for Labor to have one policy announcement, and guess what? Mr Little hasn't announced a single one yet.
Order. Order. Question number 3, Stuart Smith.